Many times in the past years, we have reviewed some of the miracles that Jesus Christ performed during his ministry here on this earth. And they're pretty dramatic and pretty exciting to talk about and to read about. But during many of these healings, there was another group of individuals that were constantly judging his actions and his motives. They didn't like what he was doing. They had it in their minds that they were right and that Jesus Christ was a troublemaker and he was not respectful to them, which really irritated them. Let's begin today by turning to Luke chapter 6. Luke chapter 6. Here in Luke 6, we'll see a couple of the examples of the interactions between Jesus Christ while he was performing miracles and some of these other individuals, the Pharisees and scribes primarily, who were so judgmental about him and his whole ministry. We also want to take a peek at one of the comments that Jesus Christ made from the Sermon on the Mount, which really is applicable to this kind of behavior. As we saw in a recent Bible study and in a sermon, the Sermon on the Mount is just chock full of all-encompassing discussions regarding how a Christian should be living their life. It's just one thing after the other after the other. It almost reminded me as I was reading through it, like reading the book of Proverbs. One proverb after the other, after the other, after the other. Again, this is a sermon today that continues in our efforts for self-examination before the Passover this year. Let's first look at Luke 6 and see one of these judgmental confrontations that took place between Jesus Christ and the Pharisees. I'm going to begin reading in Luke 6 and verse 1. Luke 6, verse 1. Now it happened on the second Sabbath after the first that he went through the grain fields, and his disciples plucked heads of grain and ate them, rubbing them in their hands. And some of the Pharisees said to them, "Why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath?" They stop right there and say, what are they talking about? It's not lawful, I might add, because of their man-made sanctions that they placed on the Sabbath. And they wanted everybody to follow their rules. They were just waiting for his next move so that they could see what it was next that they could complain about and jab at him and be judging him on. This is one of the keys to being judgmental. Always on the lookout for someone else to make a mistake or do or say something that we don't agree with. That's being judgmental. Just like the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes. Great company. It's like we can't wait for them to make another mistake, at least by our standards, so then we can criticize them. Let's continue. Verse 3. But Jesus answering them said, "Have you not even read this, what David did when he was hungry, and he and those who were with him? How he went into the house of God, took and ate from the showbread, and also gave some to those with him, which is not lawful for anybody but the priests to eat. And he said to them, the Son of Man is also the Lord of the Sabbath." This is like an in-your-face statement. They're trying to tell him how to behave and act on the Sabbath, criticizing him and his companions about the Sabbath. He said, hey, listen, the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. Next, we have another episode where the scribes now join in with the Pharisees and just waiting for Jesus Christ to do something that they could pounce on. Verse 6. Now it happened on another Sabbath also that he entered the synagogue and taught. A man was there whose right hand was withered. I don't know if you think that's a bad thing. I mean, there's probably other worse diseases you could have, but if you stop and think about it, if your hand is all withered to like nothing, you can't do anything with it. It's basically a useless appendage unless you learn how to do it adaptively somehow, some other way. And he was probably like this for his whole life. So now it happened, and he entered the synagogue, guys whose right hand was withered. So the scribes and Pharisees watched him closely, looking out of the corner of their eye and say, what's he going to do now? Whether he would heal on the Sabbath, that they might find an accusation against him. Again, this is criticism. This is judgmental, being judgmental completely. looking for something that we can jump on. That's the judgmental attitude that I just mentioned a bit ago. They just can't wait for another opportunity to criticize, so they keep looking for one, sitting and waiting. They know sooner or later it's going to happen. What a sad mentality to live with. Verse 8, but he knew their thoughts. So he's going to pull that switchy on him here again. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, arise and stand here. And he rose and stood. Again, this is in your face. He knew what their thoughts were. Their thoughts were wondering, is he going to heal on the Sabbath of all things? We've got a law against that. And Jesus does exactly what he knows they're thinking that he's going to do. Here, when Jesus was about to heal a man taken with this affliction of a withered hand, Pharisees and scribes watching intently, trying to find fault in anything that he does. You talk about a twisted approach to life. Verse 9, then Jesus said to them, I will ask you one thing. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil? To save life or to destroy life? And when he had looked around at all of them, he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he did so, and his hand was restored whole as the other. Jesus Christ said, you think you're waiting, right? I'm going to give you something to really chew on here. This is also an interesting aspect of being judgmental. Listen to this. But they were filled with rage, in verse 11, and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. Another characteristic and interesting thing about people that are judgmental. People seem to get enraged when things like this are being judgmental toward. They get all upset about it. And they want their pound of flesh. They want retaliation. Again, what a sad and warped mentality. These are only two of several examples of being judgmental by the Pharisees, Sadducees, and scribes toward Jesus Christ. There were many of them. It is interesting to me, on the heels of these two episodes we just read, that Jesus Christ delivered what seems to be a part of like what we call the Sermon on the Mount. And he made a very interesting statement after having these two confrontations with the Pharisees and scribes. Drop down to verse 37 of Luke 6. Again, this is an interesting statement given how he had been just treated by some of the leadership of the Jews. Verse 37, judge not, and you shall not be judged. Condemn not, and you shall not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over will be put into your bosom. For with the same measure that you use, it will be measured back to you. That is a mouthful. This is one of the many places in the Bible where we were told that how we treat and how we deal with other people is the exact same way God is going to treat and deal with us. We set the standard for how God will treat us. Not unlike Christ, Paul had to stand up to these things of people being judgmental about him and his ministry as well. He went through a lot of that as we rehearsed when we went through the book of Acts Bible study. Let's next flip over to 1 Corinthians chapter 6. 1 Corinthians chapter 6. While you're turning to 1 Corinthians 6, let me share an interesting little ditty with you. Sometimes our being judgmental might be like the woman who was bitten by a rabid dog, and it looked like she was going to die from the rabies. The doctor told her to put her final affairs in order. So the woman took a pen and paper right there and then began writing furiously. In fact, she wrote and wrote and wrote. Finally, the doctor said, that sure is a long will you're making. She snorted, will nothing. I'm making a list of all the people I'm going to bite. We as human beings want retaliation. And she wanted to share her disease and poison with everybody else who had mistreated her in her life. We want our revenge. We want our pound of flesh. And that is a sad, sad way to approach life. Because guess what? You're never going to get it. Never going to happen. You might think it does in ways because you get your mental twinges titillated by something that is done bad to the other person. You take pride and joy in that. Yeah, all of us have suffered from this, but we all need to really get over it. Paul also suffered from others being judgmental of him too, but he also had another perspective regarding judging itself. Some people probably use the scriptures like we're going to look at next in 1 Corinthians 6 as their excuse or rationale for being judgmental of other people. Let's pick it up here in 1 Corinthians 6 and we'll begin in verse 1. 1 Corinthians 6, verse 1. Is that right? Yeah. Dare any of you, having a matter against another, go to law before the unrighteous and not before the saints? Do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if the world will be judged by you, are you unworthy to judge the smallest matters? Do you not know that we shall judge angels? How much more things that pertain to this life? Paul's giving a perspective here about people taking each other to court when they're in the same congregation. They're members, they're blood brothers, if you will, blood sisters. He said, can't you get this kind of stuff resolved between you instead of going to the unrighteous and letting them decide for you? But then he takes it a bit further. He says, don't you know you're going to eventually be judging angels? Why can't you start judging amongst yourselves on these smaller matters? Yes, there is a time coming where we will be given the responsibility to be judges over all of mankind. That's not now. None of us have been given that responsibility now. You can add Revelation 20, verse 4 to your notes. I'm not going to turn there, which supports what we just read in 1 Corinthians 6 about becoming judges in the millennium under the rule of Jesus Christ. There is, however, an important difference between being a judge and being judgmental. The definition of being judgmental includes these: making or tending to make judgments as to value, importance, and other things. Often specifically judgments considered to be lacking in tolerance, compassion, objectivity, characterized by a tendency to judge harshly. That's being judgmental. To judge, on the other hand, means to form an opinion about something through careful weighing of evidence and the testing of premises to get the facts and make an objective decision. Two completely different characteristics. Obviously, this would be when it's one's responsibility to judge. Turn now over to Matthew 7. Matthew chapter 7. This chapter of Matthew 7 is right in the middle of the actual Sermon on the Mount. In it, Matthew recorded a much more detailed discussion on being judgmental than we saw in Luke 6, and what some of the dangers are of this type of behavior if it becomes a part of our being. There are lessons and points that we've discussed and heard in other messages about this, but I felt important to review it this year prior to Passover. As the saying goes, if the shoe fits, as the Dutch-German author Thomas von Kempen wrote, in the judging of others, a man labors in vain, often errs, and easily sins. But in judging and examining himself, he always labors fruitfully. Let's look at Matthew 7 and see what Jesus Christ had to say about this subject. Let's begin in Matthew 7 and verse 1. Judge not, that you be not judged. For with what judgment you judge, you will be judged. And with the measure you used, it will be measured back to you. These are lessons about being a Christian we really do need to take to heart. Like in the example prayer that Christ gave us in Matthew 6. Forgive, because you are going to be forgiven the way you forgive others. And why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not consider the plank in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me remove the speck from your eye, and look, a plank is in your eye? Like a giant 2x4 sticking out of the side of your head, and they just got a little speck in their eye. He said, hypocrite, first remove the plank from your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. And that statement by Jesus Christ was understood by others throughout history. One Roman playwright, simply known as Terence, who lived around 175 to 145 BC, was quoted in one of his plays as saying this: human nature is so constituted that all see and judge better in the affairs of other men than in their own. In other words, busybodies. Let's turn to Romans 14. Romans 14. Another thing that I've noticed over the years about individuals who are judgmental, they tend to make others feel uncomfortable, since those who are being judged are always looking to criticize somebody. We need to ask ourselves, do we like being watched by others? Being watched to be criticized. Watching you, watching your every action, watching every word that comes out of your mouth, waiting for the opportunity to criticize. How would you like to be treated like that? Wouldn't make you feel very good, would it? A judgmental person gives another person the feeling of being judged virtually all the time. And they sense it. Because once it happens, it'll happen again. They know that. And in doing so, we make ourselves very unpleasant to be around. When we're judgmental at church, we too make others feel uncomfortable and uneasy, and definitely unloved. And that is a sin, no matter how you cut it. Paul addresses this subject rather pointedly here in Romans 14. Let's actually begin in Romans 14 and verse 4. Who are you to judge another's servant? To his own master he stands or falls. Indeed, he will be made to stand, for God is able to make him stand. Then drop down to verse 10. Paul continues in his thought here. But why do you judge your brother? Or why do you show contempt for your brother? For we shall all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. Paul then quotes from Isaiah 45 in verse 11. For it is written, as I live, says the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall confess to God. And then he goes on, he said, so then each of us shall give account of himself to God. And this is part of what we were doing as we go through this self-examination prior to Passover. It's a process. And what I've been trying to do is point out things we sometimes have a tendency to overlook as being sin. Verse 13, therefore let us not judge one another anymore, but rather resolve this, not to put a stumbling block or a cause to fall in our brother's way. And if you think about it, brethren, this is yet another form of causing division, which we know God and Jesus Christ hate. They hate it. Let's now turn over to James, chapter 1. James, chapter 1. Another interesting thing It seems like to me, at least, that those who are more judgmental of others, when something like that happens to them, they are the first to demand an apology. And they always seem to hold grudges. To conquer this ugly trait, we must first come to the acknowledgement that we are, in fact, judgmental. I will say again that this is not unlike gossiping. We've done it for so long, it just comes natural to us, and we think nothing of it. Yet it's destroying relationships, destroying the possibility for congregations to be strengthened together. It's also interesting that those people who are judgmental a lot seem to sometimes find themselves on the wrong end of their judgment. They got it wrong. As you turn to James 1, let me share another little story with you. Not sure if it's true, but you sure like it to be. Late one summer evening in Broken Bow, Nebraska, a very weary truck driver pulled his rig into an all-night truck stop. The waitress had just served him when three tough-looking, leather-jacketed motorcyclists of the Hells Angels type decided to give him a hard time. Not only did they verbally abuse him, one grabbed the hamburger off of his plate, another took a handful of his French fries, and the third one picked up his coffee and began to drink it. How would you respond to that? Well, this trucker did not respond as one might expect. Instead, he calmly rose, picked up his check, walked to the front of the room, put the check and his money on the cash register, and went out the door. Didn't say a word. The waitress followed him to put the money in the till and stood watching out the door as the big truck drove away into the night. When she returned, one of the bikers said to her, "Well, he's not much of a man, is he?" She replied, "Well, I don't know about that, but he sure ain't much of a truck driver. He just ran over 3 motorcycles on his way out of the parking lot." You talk about being wrong in your judgment of someone. Let's look at what James says here in James chapter 1. Let's pick it up in James 1 and verse 19. Again, to correct this type of judgmental behavior, we first have to admit that we are doing it ourselves, or it'll never change. Verse 19 of James 1. So then, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath. For the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. Never has, never will. Therefore lay aside all filthiness and overflow of wickedness, and receive with meekness the implanted word which is able to save your souls. But be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man observing his natural face in a mirror. For he observes himself and goes away and immediately forgets what kind of man he is. But he who looks into the perfect law of liberty and continues in it, and is not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, this one will be blessed in what he does. We are urged throughout the Bible to grow into the perfect example of Jesus Christ. We've heard that in many messages over the years, yet none of us matches up to that measurement yet. Turn next back to Philippians chapter 1. Philippians chapter 1. We all have our faults. Jesus Christ and God both know that we are loaded with faults. They just don't want us to stay in those faults. And how we measure our own faults is always an interesting effort in human nature. As we turn to Philippians 1, let me share another cute story that makes a good point about evaluating ourselves. There was once a little boy who excitedly told his mom that he had just measured himself and he was 6 feet tall. Mom smiled, and she was a little skeptical. So she asked him to measure himself again while she watched. She discovered the problem when the boy took out not a 12-inch ruler, but a 6-inch ruler. He had calculated well. He was 6 ruler heights tall. He just had the wrong ruler, the wrong standard to be measured by. We often fall into the same problem ourselves. We often judge ourselves by a very different standard than even the one we judge others by. We need to, as James showed us, which we just read, turn the mirror in our own direction. This righteousness we are seeking is a goal that is only accomplished through God and through Jesus Christ and their help. To attain God's righteousness, we need his help, we need his strength. Jesus Christ is our righteousness. By working in and through us, he will help us prevail. But it takes effort on our parts as well. That's what Paul addresses here in Philippians 1. Let's begin in Philippians 1 and verse 8. Paul writes here, he said, "For God is my witness, how greatly I long for you all with the affection of Jesus Christ. And this I pray, that your love may abound still more and more in knowledge and in all discernment, that you may approve the things that are excellent, that you may be sincere and without offense till the day of Christ, being filled with the fruits of righteousness which are by Jesus Christ to the glory and praise of God." We all stand or fall to our God and to our Savior, Jesus Christ, whom we must give account. Overcoming being judgmental is hard. Probably as hard, if not harder, than gossiping. Because many of us have done it for so long that it's just a part of our being. We don't think anything of it. It's just the way we are. Hopefully we have seen today that acting and behaving like this, for the most part, brings undesirable results. And more importantly, to others, and to become more loving. We must recognize that it is correct to judge ourselves, but not to judge other people. That is up to their master judger, Jesus Christ, as we read about in Romans 14. As we get ready to close, let's go over to Galatians chapter 6. Galatians chapter 6. We need to recognize right from wrong. We need to recognize good from evil. We need to recognize righteousness from iniquity, but not scrutinize others to try to find these faults in them. That's not our job. When we see a fault in others, we should seek help for them, to help them, instead of judging them. Paul here in Galatians 6 gives the charge to the Galatians that those who are spiritual, acting more Christian-like, are to help to restore a person with a fault and to help that person work through it. Being judgmental only pushes people away and establishes self-righteousness in the judge, all of which is bad for everybody. Let's begin in Galatians 6 and verse 1. "Brethren, if a man is overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted," so you don't become self-righteous. "Bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ." This is how we need to be looking out for one another, not condemning, but encouraging and loving in gentleness, helping each other. "For if anyone thinks himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But let each one examine his own work, and then he will have rejoicing in himself alone and not in another." And folks, that's what all these messages are aimed at, focusing on us and what we may need to change in our lives. "For each one shall bear his own load," in verse 5. "Let him who is taught the word share in all good things with him who teaches. Then Paul summarizes his message with a very powerful statement about all that we do in our lives. And this should make us shiver a little bit. Verse 7, do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. For he who sows to the flesh will of the flesh reap corruption. But he who sows to the Spirit will of the Spirit reap everlasting life. It's all about our focus. And that stems from the way we think. Let us not grow weary while doing good, for in due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all, especially to those who are of the household of faith. One last scripture, 1 Corinthians 11. 1 Corinthians 11. Here in 1 Corinthians 11 is where this whole focus of self-examination began several weeks ago. Brethren, the church of God will have a warmer and a more welcoming atmosphere and be a more godly body if we learn to conquer this ugly trait of being judgmental. If we all spent more time focusing on loving one another, we would have little time to be judgmental. The next time we feel we need to judge someone, let it be ourselves. Let's look once more at what Paul told us here in 1 Corinthians 11, just two verses. First, 1 Corinthians 11, verse 28. But let a man examine himself, and so let him eat of the bread and drink of the cup. Verse 31. For if we would judge ourselves, we would not be judged. Just like Jesus Christ said in Matthew 7, judge not, that you be not judged. Brethren, may God help us all root out this congregational and life killer, the horrible tendency of being judgmental. Have a good Sabbath.